Today on Co-op for Two, Penny Dreadfuls of Victorian London. What explains the bizarre experience we had playing this game? Stay tuned to find out. Some preliminaries first. This will be a spoiler-free, mostly spoiler-free review. As a reminder, I buy all of the games we play on this channel myself. So if you want to see more unbiased reviews like this, I hope you'll give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. In the first half of this video, I'm going to talk about the game, the mechanics, show you a quick playthrough of the tutorial scenario. And in the second half, I'll talk about what goes wrong here. You can watch a full playthrough of all of the cases in this box on YouTube. I've played through them all, and at the end of each of those is a spoiler-filled discussion. So if you've played the game and want to watch something afterwards to talk about the experience, to see if you've gone crazy or not, you can watch those. Or you could just jump to the end of this video using the timestamps on YouTube if you just want to hear my final thoughts. So what is Penny Dreadfuls of Victorian London? It's a mouthful in the name, and that pattern of over-explaining everything with giving two names to every case, naming the series of things, continues throughout this box. It's a little bit self-indulgent, but it is essentially a 1 to 5 player narrative mystery game, told mostly through cards, plays quickly in about an hour. Essentially, it's sort of a souped-up choose-your-own-adventure game with branching paths. Very similar to a choose-your-own-adventure book, and I'll come back to that. There is a mystery in each case that you're sort of pushed to try to understand, but you don't have to solve it. You don't get asked questions. You basically just choose branching paths and then get to an ending. Either a neutral ending, a positive ending, or a negative ending. There are 3 cases in the box, 3 full cases with 72 oversized cards each, and then a little tutorial case, short 15 cards to teach you the system. And we're going to play through one path in that very quickly as part of this review. The cases are mostly on the cartoonish side, except that there's some real adult gore and violence, and the game is rated at 13 and up, and I think that's probably appropriate. The back of the box does not tell you whether this is a cooperative or competitive game. That's because that issue is a little unclear in the game itself. Formally speaking, I guess you would call this a competitive game. There are rules for picking the winner or loser, although the group can lose as a whole, and you can play it solo, in which case you could win or the game could win. On the other hand, it is essentially a cooperative experience. You basically go through the game as a group, make decisions as a group, but there are some mechanics for deciding who makes decisions and mechanics for deciding who wins the game, which I think is a poorly chosen term here. I'll talk about that in a bit. It retails, it sells, you can get it now from somewhere between $40 and $50. I purchased this for $50 when it first came out a couple of weeks ago in November of 2023. It was created by the same folks who designed Letters from Whitechapel, which is a well-regarded hidden movement game. So I think it's useful to glance through the rules here and just point out a couple of things. Then we're going to play the tutorial scenario together to give you an idea of what it's like to play this game. So there's a lot of history, discussion of the authors. Each of the three cases were written by a different author. There's a description of the symbols here and the parts. Most of this is not as complicated as it looks here, but it's well done. It tells you how to set up everything, what all the pieces are, how they work together. There's some discussion of strategy. It's all fine. A discussion of what the tokens mean. There are all kinds of variety of these tokens. They're all abstract. They come in 4 different shapes, in 4 different colors, and 4 different symbols on each. So lots of combinations. And then there's some attempt to tell you that colors mean one thing, shapes mean another. It's not very well explained or consistently followed in the game, and there are too many combinations to keep track of. Now, what I really wanted to show you here was the solo and 2-player rules. So here they are. They start here, and they continue to here. These are all the special rules you play for a solo or 2-player game. Continue here, and then continue down here. So if you're the kind of person that doesn't like special rules for solo, this may rub you a little bit the wrong way, but I think that would be a mistake. The solo rules here, in fact, the solo rules are the same as the 2-player rules. You have to use a special system. They feel like they're a bit complex when you read it. They are a little fiddly, but there are some advantages to that over the multiplayer rules. And in practice, it's the same experience. So I wouldn't feel like you're playing a different game if you play the solo version. So we're going to play through the tutorial scenario here. It's short. You're going to have to take my word for it that I'm not spoiling anything of any importance. And we're just going to be going through one path here, particularly short one. Nothing spoiled to worry about. Okay, so we set up the board according to the rules. There's some special solo rules here, which we use these tokens only for the solo and 2-player. But the tutorial mostly walks you through the rules, although not the special solo 2-player rules. I'm just going to go through this quickly. So in general, you read the back of the card and then the front of the card. The first few cards here are just introducing us to the setting and the rules. In a multiplayer game, as you go through these cards, they frequently tell you, okay, pass the turn to the next player. Being the active player basically just lets you break ties and do the reading. Okay, so anyway, it tells us to start the game with 5 of these cubes that we use to vote and pass tests for each player. So I'm just going to put these off to the side for me. And then it tells you that the yellow pawn here should start out on A. Now I want to show you that here are the 2 pawns you'll be using most of the time, the yellow and the orange. The yellow are for stars, the orange are for co-stars. You can see the color on the card is nicely between the 2. And this symbol, though, is for the stars that are yellow. Another 5-pointed star is for the co-stars, which are orange. The symbols get even more confusing as you go. But okay, so our star starts out here. Next card says, study this art, even though none of the art on any of the cards helps you to study them. Okay. Now we're told who the star of this story is, John Neal. He is the star of the table. A symbol is used to denote him, which does not match any on the board. That's just par for the course here for this game. It introduces you here to the setting. It tells you to interject with this card, which basically just means read this card and then come back and finish reading the other card. Here we're told to take the precinct location and put it on 1. So here is our policeman. He's at the precinct. Then we continue. Again, it's just repeating the rules here. You can see most of these rules tell us to put these cards in the trash, which means we don't get to look at them again. So there's a little bit of a memory element if you forgot what's going on here. I'll just keep them face up for now. There's also an archive where you put cards that you are allowed to reference. And then you've got card sections for the star, the co-star, the guest stars, and a villain that might come out. Okay, here's our next card, and the first one that actually gives us a choice. We're told that there's a fire, and we've got two choices. You always have two choices. We can either choose the left-hand side. I'm going there. My former colleagues may need my help. Or we can vote for the right-hand choice, which says, I'll leisurely stroll towards Brady Street and have a drink at the Britannia before patrolling. So as a group, we're going to make a choice between these two. We do that by voting. Everyone takes one cube, puts it in their left or right hand, reveals it simultaneously, or you could discuss it ahead of time if you want. If you're playing solo, you just get one vote on the right hand or the left hand side. Everyone only ever votes with one cube. If you're playing with more than two players, then the majority decision wins. If you're playing the solo or the two-player game, after the players vote, let's say I choose to vote for the left-hand side, or let's say the left-hand side, I'm going to go check out this fire. Then you turn over one of these tokens, and you see how the AI voted. In this case, the AI votes one cube on the left, one cube on the right. So the left hand breaks the tie. It's 2 to the left, 1 to the right. So we're going to do the left-hand choice. All the human players, if there was 1 or 2 players, would spend this cube that got used for the majority vote. This gets discarded, so I'm down to 4 cubes. And then whoever voted for something else, in which case this is a little odd since the AI voted for both, basically goes in a pile, either the 3 pile, which represents the game having an influence on the outcome, or this pile, meaning the game didn't get its way. We'll talk about why that's important in a little bit. Okay, we voted for the left-hand side, and then it tells us what card to jump to. It says go to first. Before you do that, 5 interjects. 5 just tells you about how to vote. And then we get to 7. Okay, 7 says the pawn moves up to C, and the warehouse token comes into play. So you see another way this game works. You don't have control of where to move. The story just moves you, tells you what location comes out. Then we read the back of this, and we've got another choice. Tells us a little bit more about the fire that's unfolding. The fire's getting worse. Better hurry up. That's our left-hand choice. Our right-hand choice is, what if that woman needed help? I'll go back and check that everything's fine. Okay, so again, if you were playing 2 players, you'd each get to vote. Multiple players, the majority would win. I'm going to pick the right-hand side here. That's going to be what I want to do. Now let's see what the game has to say. The game actually voted 2 cubes for the left-hand side. So I don't get to do what I wanted to do playing solo. The game randomly decided we're going to do the left-hand side. I keep my cube because I didn't get what I want. This tile, we only look at the top. The bottom is for trials. The top says the game got what it wanted. Some of these tiles are white, some are black. The white means the player breaks the tie. The black means the game breaks the tie. So the game got what it wanted. So this goes over here in the 3 pile. And we do what the game wanted to do, which is better hurry up. So this goes in the trash. And card 10 comes into play. Okay. All right, so this tells us we turn the corner, we see the fire, put this in the trash, and 14 comes into play. Okay, so a little bit more story. 14 comes into play. All right, So this is a check. So the story unfolds. We find a dead body, and this is a check. It says, to succeed, John Neal must have the blue round alpha chit. Otherwise, it's missed. So we don't have a chit. We didn't encounter one. We never saw it. We don't know what it is. So we missed. Okay, so it tells us a little bit of the story. Her skirt is completely soaked in blood. All players receive an extra cube. And continue to 15 and read the neutral epilogue. So our game is over. The game is ended. It tells us to jump to 15 and read the neutral epilogue. So here is the neutral epilogue. It tells us a little bit about what happened. And then it says neutral. Let me just read you the story so you know what you're in for here. Her genital organs have been stabbed several times. Her abdomen is also lacerated by several lateral cuts. Neutral. Polly was slaughtered by an unknown killer. John Neal will see that this is just the beginning of a nightmare. It's not enough. Who contributed the least? Whoever has a white circle gains 1 cube. Whoever has the most cubes wins. Okay, so in this solo game, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cubes, and the game has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cubes. That's what you count the 1 and the 2. Because we got the neutral ending, the winner is the person who contributed the least to getting the outcome. So in our case, the game contributed the least, so the game wins, and I, as the player, lose. And that is how you play Penny Dreadfuls. The actual real full game is a little more involved, but not much more. So I walked you through the tutorial case because I think it's hard to convey actually how the game plays without seeing it in motion. But let's summarize some of the key ideas here. There are these voting cubes, these cubes you use, and you actually use them for several things. You use them for voting. Each player always votes with 1 cube. For a multiplayer game, it's much more straightforward. Majority wins. But you also use them for something else. You use them for what's called trials. Occasionally you'll get a card that says, okay, you have to fight this person. The group has to contribute 2 cubes per player in total. And then the game mechanic tells you that people can secretly bid how many cubes they want to contribute. And then you reveal them. And if as a group you've contributed enough, then you succeed. If you don't, you fail. And whoever contributes the most gets one of these white cubes. These are sort of like little tiebreakers at the end of the game. That's all they're useful for. And then the game has this interesting mechanic where you don't answer questions the way you might expect in a normal mystery game, but you get to 1 of 3 endings when you play each case. You get to a neutral ending, which is basically says it's not good, so whoever contributed the least to the outcome is the winner. And the way you see who contributed the least is whoever has the most cubes left contributed least. It is awkward. And the AI game has the same thing with moving around these tokens in this fiddly way to keep track of how much the game contributed to the outcome. If you get the negative ending, you basically lose as a group no matter what. If you get a positive ending, then you look to the player who contributed the most to the victory, which is the player who has the least black cubes left. It's a clever idea. It's very odd because the group has to work together to win. And trying to win is going to result in some suboptimal outcomes here. But really the biggest flaw is that you have no idea whether you're going to win a case or not. The outcomes are quite arbitrary and random. So it feels like it's a clever idea of letting a person be a winner. And I think they would be much better off if they said not winner or loser, but the most valuable player. So the most valuable player is the person who was on the majority side of choices most often. That makes some sense, and I like the idea of a group getting to vote for what choice they want to make. And it makes sense that sort of if you were in the minority on all these votes and didn't get your way, that you would be least to blame for a bad outcome. I think that's a clever idea. And I think it is a clever way to have a game that's mostly a cooperative experience. At least, like when you play these games where the group has to make a decision, occasionally a player will be like, look, you guys are making a terrible decision. And it's nice to have a way to sort of recognize that, to have a player be like, no, I don't agree with it. I am not voting for that. You are sealing your own doom if you guys make that choice. I like that idea. And we're going to get back to the solo and two-player use of these tokens. It's an interesting attempt to move the rules to a solo player, and it actually changes things. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. The first thing you saw in the tutorial scenario is that if you play according to the pure solo rules, a good chunk of the time you're going to make a choice in one of these binary choices and the game's going to override you. That's just ridiculous for a game where the only thing you're doing is making choices. The idea that you would play this case, get to these choices, which can sometimes result in instant losses, have these choices be made by the game, and then have your compensation be that you don't get blamed for the bad ending is really weird. So I would not play with the solo rules as written at all. I would just throw that totally out the window. But if you're playing solo, just play with the two-player rules. In the two-player rules, you basically play, you can still read everything. It's basically the same exact game, except you have double the cubes. And every time you vote, you can place 2 cubes out. That makes it more interesting because all of the AI tokens, the most they ever do is put 2 cubes in one direction. So if you play with that, then when you get to a choice, you can either spend 2 cubes on one particular choice and almost guarantee that you'll get to make that choice. The cost of that is that these 2 will get spent and you'll have 2 less cubes. Whereas if you encounter a choice that you don't think is important, you can split your vote and then one of your cubes will get kept. This does, however, bring up one of the flaws in this system for picking winners and losers, this whole rule mechanic about voting, which is that the group would be much better off strategically to always split their votes evenly, to coordinate so they do that. That's because if everyone votes for one thing, let's say a 5-player game, and everyone votes for one choice that the group agrees is the right thing to do, then those 5 cubes get lost. And those cubes are used to defeat these trials. So you want to have as many cubes as possible to win trials. So you'd be better off splitting the vote so at least half of them get kept by the group. Which is also a problem because the whole gaming mechanics of conserving cubes goes against the idea that if you have a good outcome, you want to have the least number of cubes. So I guess you could try to argue that it's a little bit of push and pull, but the fact that you really can't predict the outcome of these games and that when you come across these trials, if you fail them, you basically are going to lose the game. It's very hard to use any of these rules as a real strategy. They all sort of go against each other in a way that doesn't make for interesting gameplay, just added complication. Now let's talk a little bit about these items here. As I said, 4 different colors in 4 different shapes with 4 different letters on each of them, Greek letters, alpha, beta, gamma, and delta, as if you might have a hard enough time managing all this. Let's just throw in some Greek letters here. The idea here is to build a kind of generic system that you could use to create any kind of story. There is a little bit of logic that the game tries to suggest for when a token might be blue, yellow, red, black. Some are like common items. Some are used for more frequent for items that have limited resources. And then the colors have some meaning and the shapes have some other meaning, although they overlap. It's pretty convoluted. There's no way to keep track of it and remember it. But basically, you've got, 64 different unique tokens. Every token is unique. And you'll occasionally come out with a card that says, okay, you find a notebook on the ground, take the yellow pentagon alpha token to represent that. You can't remember that that's what it is, but it says it on the card. And then occasionally you'll get a card that says, here are 5 items on this card, you can choose one. And then it tells you to get a black triangle gamma that represents the rope, and get a square alpha black token that represents this. And you spend a couple minutes populating these tokens on this card. Each one is just to represent a unique thing. And you'll move it around between characters. There's one of the most interesting aspects, rules, mechanics in this game is this idea that you have different characters that come out. They're either stars or co-stars, and they'll have these tokens, these item tokens on them, showing that that's their possession. They have possession of that item. And then different people may have different limits. This character may only be able to carry 3 items, and none of them can be black. And this character can carry 2 items, and only one of them can be red. And the stars all travel together as yellow, and frequently you'll have more than one star traveling together. Then you can have a co-star, which can move around separately, has its own items. A villain moves around separately, has its own items. Remember, you don't get to control where these move. The story just moves them and unfolds them. But what's interesting is that when you read the back of a card, after you read it, you have an opportunity to move tokens around between characters that are next to each other. So if you have 2 stars, you can switch items between them. And if you're next to a co-star, you could switch items with them. And it's a very interesting sort of twist on, it almost feels like a point and click adventure where you have items that you could theoretically use and share. And the promise here is that there's some deduction and logic about using items. And occasionally you'll get a choice between buying certain items. It's a very interesting idea. It occasionally creates moments that are interesting where you're like, before we flip over this card, let's just think, is there some important item that a certain character should have? None of it is really actually realized in the 3 cases in this box. So it is mostly a missed opportunity, but it is one of the more interesting mechanics that this game introduces. The only thing that really jumped out as we were dealing with these myriad dozens of unique tokens is that it seems like a real miss in terms of a missed opportunity. Why are these not little cards with pictures of the items? The whole point of these playing with these cards with these nice illustrations, and the whole point of having a custom unique deck for each story, why not have cards for the items? Then you wouldn't have to try to remember what these weird symbols are on these cards. What do they represent? Let me go look it up. Sometimes the card's been flipped face down. You got to go search for it. Why not have a little card for each item? Then you could see it. You could read how it works, what it does. It seems like a real missed opportunity there. Let's talk a little bit more about this spatial map here. Once again, the promise of it is intriguing. There's lots of card-based mystery games that don't have a spatial element, and it's a thing that I really miss when we play these games. And here is this idea, this promise of a general framework for being able to move around, have certain things somewhere, the police precinct's over here, maybe you discover a drugstore over here or a bar over here. And there's a whole sets of these tokens that represent different locations. They don't functionally matter. They don't ever say anything different on them. There's cards for interior locations too. They're double-sided. They've got a little bit of art on them, but they don't do anything. And the game, the 3 cases here, don't really make use of them at all. One of the oddest thing is you don't have control over where these pawns move at all. You're never given any choice, even. The game moves them around as you reveal cards. So maybe a choice says, do you want to go here or go here? As you flip a card, it's just a way of visualizing the story and bringing new things out. There's no real mechanic that makes use of it. You really, in all of the cases we played, I don't think there was a single real time where we needed to have the board or the pawns or the locations at all. They are not relevant. The only slight time when it comes into play is the idea that you can only trade when you're near someone. In practice, this happens when you're at the same place as someone, and maybe it happened once in all of the cases, 3 cases we played. Very odd. Although you can see what they were aiming for here. A generic framework, you could imagine a case that did make use of the spatial layout a little bit. Okay, now I'm going to try to convey a little bit about the bizarreness of the experience we had playing through these 3 cases. You can watch all 3 of our cases on YouTube, including spoiler-filled long discussions afterwards about what went wrong, what's going on, and about the game system. But let me try to just sort of summarize some main experiences we had playing through it. First of all, we had some real problems where we went down certain paths and the game had bugs, mistakes, where it thought a card should be out when it wasn't. In one case, a absolutely critical moment of the game, there was a card that wasn't out that we couldn't interact with that was key to solving the game. Much more frequently, some ambiguous rules, some of which really did affect the outcome or the sort of finale showdown. Rules that were, in some cases, maybe a translation error, but seemed more fundamental than that. We did encounter some translation errors. This was originally written in Italian, and sometimes that shows. Definitely, having looked through the cards afterwards, you could go down paths where characters were talked about even though you didn't meet them, where there were key setup things that didn't make sense because of a path that was chosen. Maybe you could chalk that up to a lack of play testing, but whatever it is, there were lots of things that felt like they were a bit broken. I use that word loosely just to mean that there were ways you could play this game. It almost feels like a little bit of an open world that weren't anticipated or play tested. And you can see why it would be so hard to play test things, because there are all these item tokens and symbols. They're written very small, sometimes using bad symbols or colors on the cards. This would be an almost impossible game to give to someone to play test. There were also a bunch of times that were more enjoyably bizarre because of the nature of this being a kind of open world system. There was at one point where we met an animal, then the game told us treat this animal like a token and put it here and put it on the board, but it's really a token, and the rules for the tokens show that you can pick them up, and then it said you could assign a token to the other card. So we basically ended up grabbing this dog, throwing it in our purse, giving the dog something to hold in its mouth, a weapon that we weren't allowed to hold. It was a bizarre moment. It was completely unclear. It was clear that it seemed like you shouldn't be able to do it. And then later on, the game had the dog running around, even though we were carrying it. So it broke the game in an amusing, interesting way. On a later case, the rules seemed to make clear that you couldn't do that in that game. So again, felt like untested, unplay-tested aspects of this in ways that some of our group really didn't like. A bunch of the people playing thought, this is a broken, unfun, frustrating game. I had a much more enjoyable experience watching the wheels come off this thing and waiting to see what kind of craziness was going to happen, what kind of chaos was going to happen. So that's the rules. There's also this thing where the game keeps telling you study the art and the titles of cards because they hold clues. And halfway through, we realized, wait a second, it's not that there are clues to deduce in the art of these cards. It seems like occasionally a card is basically a picture of something, which is telling you that the next time you get a chance to make a choice, choose the choice that that picture referred to, even though that picture had no reason to be on that card. It was a very strange feeling. And in general, the feeling I got consistently while playing this game is that this was like a game from some alternate universe with someone who's not playing by the conventions and norms of board game development. And that's kind of what it felt like. Like if someone on another planet didn't know what board games were and you explained it briefly to them, or the term I started using for this is it felt like it was a glitched out game, like something had gone wrong. Almost felt like the game was designed by AI, by ChatGPT, where the rules all syntactically made sense, but they didn't gel together and they left loopholes that could be exploited in weird, broken ways. I want to talk a little bit more, return to the issue of these limited resource cubes, because in some sense this is one of the more interesting ideas of this game for porting a mystery game to multiplayer. And it's tempting to think about applying this idea to other games. This idea of letting people vote for choices and majority winning and then those being spent and the others being kept is a clever idea. And it's also clever to get to the end of the game and be able to say who's most responsible. I do think, though, that it's broken. And maybe broken is too strong a word, but there are incentives that go against each other here that render some of these ideas invalid or counterproductive. And the main thing is that you're using the same cubes you vote with to pass these trials. And I really think that's a real conflict and breaks the idea of keeping track of who contributed most to the victory in terms of decisions. They're also treated as limited resources, except you can never run out of cubes to vote with. You always can borrow a cube to vote with. And the group, while you would think if you're trying to figure out who's contributed most to the decisions, then you do want a genuine, honest vote about what you want to do. But that flies in the face of preserving these resources, because your best thing strategically for the group is to split your vote evenly as a group if you want to win. So that's the nature of these rules. There's some clever ideas here, but they go against each other. And then again, the idea in a solo or two-player game sort of changes the use of these cubes into a little bit of a push your luck. And I wouldn't have minded bringing a little bit of that push your luck back to the multiplayer and make it more streamlined, make it more of a working push your luck. I've talked about why I think the push your luck breaks here, because most of the tests that if you're doing a trial, the AI votes with this bottom side and votes a number of cubes, but many of the trials we encountered say subtract 1 from whatever the AI voted, and the AI votes an average of 1 or a little more than 1. So basically, there's very little push your luck that you can take advantage of here, and the trials are so critical that you dare not win a trial if you can, and you have no idea what's coming. There's no way to predict what choice will lead to what outcomes or how many more trials you have. So it's hard to make any kind of reasonable strategic decisions with the cubes. And maybe that's the best way to say it. And all of it fails because the entire structure of all of the cases we played are completely chaotic and random. There is no way to be smart about making a decision. Any choice you make about any action or any item to take seems almost entirely random. The consequences are random. Okay, some final thoughts here. In practice, this basically is, for what you get in the box, the cases you get in the box, you're basically getting a souped up, fiddly, overly complicated choose-your-own-adventure book. The actual mysteries in this box are pretty poorly done. They don't make use of much logic. There's very little to figure out. That which there is to figure out, you will probably figure out very early in the case. The choices you make and the outcomes of those choices are almost entirely random, chaotic, unpredictable. Some lead to instant death, the way they do in an adventure game, choose your own adventure book. Sometimes it leads to instant death and then you just rewind and continue. It's a little hard to rewind here. On the other hand, the games are fairly quick. Every playthrough we went through about a third of the cards. That's fairly generous in terms of alternative branches. So I do think, unlike most mystery games, you probably could play through each case 2 or 3 times and see very different outcomes. Different little mini stories. And those stories change the nature of the items you get and the conflicts you encounter. So in terms of replayability, I do think these authors can make a convincing case that you could play each case multiple times and largely see separate little branches of the story with separate little encounters and characters. You'd meet different people and see different items. Now, all of those different branches are fairly random, but they are a little bit different. And there's some value in that. From a game design perspective, there are some really cool new ideas that are being tried here. This almost feels like an experimental beta of some new ideas just thrown together. Some work, some don't. Some feel like they have potential, but weren't realized here. Many of them feel like one of these attempts that we've been seeing in mystery games recently of trying to bring in a kind of choose your own adventure, point and click text adventure elements where you have items that can be used in different ways. The potential is here as a general framework. In practice for these cases, though, it falls flat. And I do think this game was not really ready for public release. I think this feels much more like a beta, although the production quality is fine. There are also some glaringly bad choices in terms of graphic design and use of symbols and writing and color, and some very ambiguously worded text on cards. And those are going to frustrate some groups more than others. I do think it's stuff, though, that could be easily fixed with a second edition. So ultimately, lots of interesting new mechanical ideas here, which I really welcome, but not quite implemented well. And all of the multiplayer mechanics and voting and resource, the idea of a little bit of push your luck, the idea of a little bit of resource management is all welcome. I'd love to see these iterated on, but they don't work yet. Finally, some recommendations here. I would be happy to play more scenarios of this. I don't know, given how broken I've suggested these cases are, I don't know if we're going to see expansions, but I would play more. I'd like to see what other people can do with this system. And I had fun playing them, as flawed as I thought they were, and maybe broken is too harsh a term. There were points that I think would be fairly called broken, but for the most part, we could play through. We got to the end of all of them and got an ending. But I absolutely did enjoy it. I even enjoyed it when the wheels came off the wagon and things started malfunctioning and glitching out in the game rules. And in fact, that was actually the most enjoyable part. So I would be happy to go back into this world and try these things. But not everyone I played with felt that way. Some people were really frustrated with the game and felt like, bottom line, even if they overlooked all of the mechanical problems, the fact that all of the outcomes were basically random and there was no way to make good decisions in the game really ruined it for them. So I would say I can't really recommend this for players who just want to have a good experience playing a solid mystery, narrative, choose your own adventure game. And I think there are some real costs to the fiddliness of it. But I would recommend it for fans of game design issues in this space of narrative mystery games. Players who are interested, game designers who are interested in exploring experimental ideas, especially ideas dealing with multiplayers coordinating on such a game. I do think there are some interesting ideas to look at. And I think it would be possible to make a new, interesting game using this framework with a little more effort. So there you go. I'd love to hear if you disagree with me, if your group really had a good time with this, if there are things I missed. Occasionally there are games that we play and review where I'm constantly checking Board Game Geek to see what other people think. This is one of them. Any game that provokes such an interesting discussion, and certainly this one did, is not without merit. I'd like to see what these guys come up with next, and I'll see you on the next video.